Joseph Stalin was officially worshipped in his time, then reviled, now worshipped again. History is indeed fickle. Does Russia need him still, or has she found other heroes to worship and follow? Is Stalin just masochism on the Russians' part? Join me, Jan Darasz, for How We Got Here.
Born in 1878 in the small Georgian town of Gori, Joseph Stalin entered the world as Josep Bessarionis Djugashvili, the son of a cobbler and a laundress in what was then the Russian Empire. Nobody could have anticipated the impact that this man would have on history. Raised in poverty and violence, he was educated at a church school and later enrolled in the Tiflis Theological Seminary, where he encountered Marxist literature and revolutionary politics. Two schools of thought that would transform him into one of the world's most infamous communist leaders. Expelled before graduation, he joined the Bolshevik movement, organizing strikes, publishing propaganda, and carrying out bank robberies to fund the cause. After the 1917 revolution led by Vladimir Lenin, Stalin steadily accumulated power within the Communist Party. Appointed General Secretary in 1922, he used the seemingly administrative post to build alliances, sideline rivals such as Leon Trotsky, and consolidate control. By the late 1920s, he had become the unchallenged leader of the Soviet Union. Stalin's rule was marked by forced collectivization, rapid industrialization, and pervasive terror. The state-engineered famine in Ukraine, the Holodomor, the Great Purge of the 1930s, mass deportations of ethnic minorities, and brutal labor camps in the Gulag system caused immense suffering. That, combined with his rule over the USSR during the Second World War, leads historians to estimate that Stalin was responsible for roughly 10 to 20 million deaths, making his regime one of the deadliest in modern history.
I'm delighted to welcome our guest today, Marcin Kaczorowski. He's the Deputy Head of the Memory of Nations Foundation. Welcome to the programme.
Good to be here, as usual.
Can you give our viewers an outline of Stalin's place within Russian history? We'll come on to his significance and the cult later, but can you kind of round off what sort of personality he was, what his contribution was to the Communist Party as well as to the Soviet Union?
Well, let us start with quoting the source, the Moscow source, Petr Akopov, one of the main Russian propagandists. He put it this way: Stalin is not a god, he's not a devil, he's the imminent part of our Russian culture, of our tradition, of history. We cannot get rid of him. I would say he's much closer to God than the devil. And he occupies a very important spot, mainly due to him being a victor of the war against Nazi Germany, but not only. Whenever I think about Stalin, I always think about the first, speaking of mental attitude, Stalinist that I met in my life. And he wasn't a Russian, he was a colleague of mine when I was in early 2000s working in London. He was from Zimbabwe, and we were discussing Stalin. I told him he was a murderer, he was a mass murderer, he murdered millions of people, especially Russians, and he told me yes, but he did it all to make sure Russia is reformed and Russia is strong. And this is exactly the mindset of the people that we have today in Russia.
And that's how you would define a Stalinist?
Yes, he did what was necessary. Yeah, so this is kind of justifying all those horrible crimes in the name of the so-called progress. So heavy industrialization, building a huge army that defeated Nazi Germany in the end. So he's seen still sort of as a father of the nation, and he's also the man of the state. Whenever we think about the concept of merging, for example, Orthodox Church with communism, well, many people say maybe because of what's going on in Ukraine, because of the invasion, many compare Stalin, many compare Putin to Hitler. But if we think about him more in the terms of being a Mussolini, it all begins to make sense. Stalin was the man of the state. He did everything for the state, and if he did anything against the state, you were butchered. Not by the thousands as in fascist Italy, but by the millions. So even committing a crime in your mindset could get you to Gulag, or even actually being innocent but being a so-called suspect. And that's all being still justified as long as it serves the bigger concept of creating a powerful Russia.
So you have to see the big picture.
Exactly. And it's very much in the tradition of the iron-fisted rulers of Russia. It begins with the Mongol invasion, 200 years of terrorizing Ruthenian tribes by the Mongol invaders, and ruling by example, by blood example. So a prince doesn't agree with the Khan, his head is chopped off and is shown around, and this is what we do, or you better listen to us or else.
Is that the main difference between Stalin and the Eastern model and, say, a man like Napoleon or Louis XIV, who also had their personality cults?
Napoleon could be also admired for certain contributions like the law, despite being a tyrant. Also seen as a liberator of some nations, especially Poles. At least that's what he seemed to be at the time. But here this is the admiration of strength. And this is very Asian concept. So if you think about China's Mao, this is the same story. The God-given ruler, or the ruler given by the heavens, is the one who is strong, successful, and puts everyone in their place. So he can be cruel, he can be horrible. I mean, horrible from our perspective, European perspective, which is useless here. Yeah. But as long as he keeps building the state, he's the man.
So long as he's got the mandate of heaven.
Exactly. And Mao was responsible for the death of tens of millions of Chinese citizens, and he's still on the banknotes today. Maybe the previous rulers of the Communist Party in China, Deng Xiaoping, maybe he wouldn't refer directly to Mao because he was not following his example. But during the times of Xi, the more iron-fisted regime that was before, he's perhaps not seen as a model, but something as we can refer to. And similarly today, Stalin, the man who won the war, Stalin who cemented the power as a red Tsar. So Putin today is also a Tsar, merging the red past with Orthodox Church. So he very much fits the narrative.
So the ideology, the communist ideology here is unnecessary. When you say red Tsar, you're trying to conflate two mutually exclusive concepts of government. One is a God-given Tsar, the other one is a God-given party.
Exactly. I mean,
right.
And
they come to the same thing, of course.
And they don't exclude themselves because, by definition, Stalin was sort of God himself. Similar the way that Germans saw Hitler, the Soviets were made to see Stalin. And then they did. And once Stalin died, the butcher of the Russian people, millions cried. Whether they were pretending to be crying or really breaking down is a question. That's the question.
Yes, we can read some very mawkish verses from Polish poets of the 1950s about the death of Stalin. But was this did dictators like Hitler and Stalin, were they able to take advantage of the mass media of the early 20th century, radio, cinema, the arts? Was it something that could only happen to that sort of scale in the 20th century, or did this cult of personality always exist in Russian iconography or Russian culture?
I think we can find many examples, many parallel examples. They still are going to differ by definition, but perhaps some of the Prussian ideas that were mastered by the Russians were even made perfect by NKVD. So one of them was unconditional obedience of the officers, for example, and that's what NKVD used to the maximum. But if we think about propaganda itself, I think in particular the movies, the film filmmaking. That was, as we know, Lenin's favorite muse, the ninth muse, as we call it, the filmmaking. And because it gives such a subliminal effect, it was most useful and much easier to propagate than newspapers. However, the system was quite similar. If we compare the main totalitarian systems, there's only one version of truth. There's only one narrative, and I think Stalinism went much farther than Hitlerism, because it was more efficient. And I think what Goebbels said, that a lie repeated 1,000 times becomes the truth. Yeah. It was much better demonstrated by the Soviet propaganda than by the German one.
We'll come along to Stalin's post-war reputation, how it waxes and wanes, after our second clip.
More than 7 decades after his death, Joseph Stalin remains a towering and deeply polarizing figure in Russia. Responsible for mass repression, famine, labor camps, and millions of deaths, one would think the memory of Stalin would have been reduced into near universal condemnation. Instead, he occupies a complicated place in the national imagination. Recent polling by organizations such as the Levada Center has found that between roughly 45 and 70% of Russians express a positive assessment of Stalin's historical role. For many, he symbolizes state strength, wartime leadership, and superpower status. Under Stalin, the Soviet Union defeated Nazi Germany, industrialized at breakneck speed, and emerged as a global rival to the United States. In times of economic strain and geopolitical tension, that legacy of order and might can carry emotional appeal. State narratives have also softened his image, emphasizing victory in what Russians call the Great Patriotic War, while downplaying terror and repression. Public memorials to victims coexist uneasily with new statues and rehabilitated rhetoric. The result is not universal adoration, but selective memory. Stalin as a stern modernizer and wartime victor, rather than architect of purges and famine. Yet the victims of the USSR from once vassal states of the Soviet Union remember the visage of a tyrant past the manufactured facade of a great leader, where attempts at rehabilitating this image, even in Orthodox Christian icons, are met with protest. The cult of Joseph Stalin reflects both the ignorance of state crimes and a longing for victory and national grandeur of days gone by, two qualities reflected in the Russia of today.
Just before we come on to Stalin's reputation, what was the attraction of the West and of the artistic community in propagating his cult of personality? Was this a genuine belief in this idea of the great man of history, or was it fear? We have Alexander Nevsky, Eisenstein, the great film directors, great artists, and yet they cooperated in this whole machinery.
Or wasn't it cynical as much as it could be? Because if we think about what George Orwell wrote about some British journalists who first believed Poland is the problem. Oh, Poles, they always have problems with Russia. So why shouldn't Russians just take care of them? And then suddenly they became the dogged enemies of the communistic ideas. Well, we remember what George Orwell said about them. Once somebody, always a somebody. Yeah. Yes. If we look at Roosevelt and why he was such a great fan of Uncle Joe, was mostly political calculation. He was simply the man that could help destroy Nazi Germany, definitely. The United States didn't want to spend 500,000 American lives on taking Berlin. Who could do that? Stalin.
Yes.
Who would say normally, u nas ludzi mnogo. We have a lot of people.
Yes, he was ruthless enough to sacrifice hundreds of thousands in any particular battle, wasn't he?
And he's the man. He's our monster, destroying the evil monster.
So what happened to his reputation? You mentioned this idea of the wartime Uncle Joe, this genial, avuncular figure, certainly in the West. what caused his cult of personality to be tarnished in the 1950s with Khrushchev and the next generation?
It's the war of two fractions, and one fraction finished off the other one. There was always internal friction inside of the Communistic Party, and one could never be certain of their own fate in Stalinist Russia. In Nazi Germany, if someone was a loyal murderer, they could count on constant promotions, even though there was so much internal struggle between different Nazi agencies. But in the Soviet Union, one day someone was an executioner, and the other day they got themselves a bullet in the head. So it's understandable that many people were quite anxious about Stalin ruling forever, and hence there have been many hypotheses how someone might have helped Stalin in ending his life. And Khrushchev is a very good example of the change that was to some extent on the surface, because he himself was one of Stalin's butchers.
Right.
Was he involved in Stalinist crimes?
Yes, but yet he condemned his crimes, the mass murders.
Absolutely, and
What seems contradictory.
What was very comfortable was putting all the blame on one man. After all, the cult of the individual helped in that. Who is the evil man?
Shove it onto
Stalin's
him.
the one, and then we can distract the attention of the public by not mentioning thousands of NKVD officers murdering millions. He's the evil man. He broke the rules he broke the Leninist rules. So after all, communism as a whole is beneficial to the Soviet society. It's full of beautiful ideas, but they were distorted by Stalin and his crew. Absolutely, during Khrushchev's times, the communistic crimes continued, but we cannot talk about the genocide that undoubtedly took place during the Stalinist era. So there was some progress. In Poland, the era of Gomułka and the era of Bierut is also incomparable in terms of terror, so people felt that the times changed. And allegedly, there were some people in Georgia, I believe, to my recollection, who even started protests against besmirching the memory of Generalissimus. Well, how dare they? How dare they destroy the memory?
So how is his reputation, how did that progress or regress or stagnate in the 1960s and 70s? He died in March 1953, had this denunciation by Khrushchev, famous denunciation. How did his memory fade? Was it that the Soviet Union had found a new model of communism, a better, if more efficient form of communism economically without butchering hundreds of thousands? How did that?
In Brezhnev's era, he was kindly swept under the carpet. So better not to mention that, better not to dig into those mass graves and leave that all behind. I remember an interesting first-hand story. My father was a colonel in the Polish Air Force at the time, I think 1970s. And he would talk to one of his counterparts from the Russian Air Force, and they spoke about Katyn and about other crimes that Soviet Union committed against Polish people. And he said, well, yes, you know, Stanislav, but you have to understand, we have dozens, we have hundreds of Katyns in our country. So this sort of apathy led to really zero result. I mean, the archipelago Gulag could be written, but what did that really change? No one. There were people. There were very few people who were truly held responsible.
So the millions who died just don't make that impact anymore. You just become fatigued.
And we still go back to the what we talked about at the beginning. Many Russians believe that although those crimes were horrible, they were kind of unavoidable or even necessary to strengthen the country. Yes, he was a horrible, harsh ruler, but in the end, maybe he really had to do all those things
Yes.
he did.
Tough
In the name
tough
of the,
love.
in the name of the progress.
What's the state of Russian historiography today about Stalin? We hear that polls, opinion polls, seem to have experienced a renaissance of his experience, of his life and achievements. Can we say that President Putin is a Stalinist, or does he not draw on that inspiration today? Does he draw on more? He always seems to be drawing on the example of Peter I, for example, the imperial,
Absolutely.
the Tsarist tradition. Where does Stalin fit into all of this today?
I think Putin in his cold-blooded approach is a pragmatist. So it's a kind of fascist pragmatism, whatever serves the state. So if Russian people still like Stalin and they cherish his memory, why not use it? Plus, he did the impossible, so blending the Orthodox Church with the communistic past. And not all our viewers from the West realize that most of the churches were destroyed by the Bolsheviks. The priests were practically wiped out. So it's kind of blending water with the fire to create some steam for the Russian state. So yeah, it is kind of achieved in accordance with an old Bolshevik rule. The bigger the absurd, the more easily people will believe that. And so it seems that the Russian state sometimes commemorates the memory of the victims of Stalinism, while at the same time stressing that Stalin was a great ruler. 90% of the monuments, to what I know, according to what I know, the 90% of the monuments of Stalin today were built lately.
Yes.
And in Putin's era, so most of them were dismantled, and now this cult of Stalin is being renewed, refreshed. As he's the man who won. So even if we look at the World War II historiography, the Russians do not talk so much about their victims.
Yes.
Even though there were millions and millions of victims of Hitler, but they seem to be stressing on the victory in 1945.
Sacrifice on the altar of victory.
Exactly.
A final question to you, Marcin. Does this mean that Russia needs this one guy at the top to make all the decisions? Is it just too big and sprawling and too Eastern to have any other system within it? It's a bit of a futuristic, futurology question.
Well, Russia never had real democracy except for the short period of Yeltsin's rule. And I remember talking to some acquaintances from Moscow I had. They have the worst memories from that period, where people were being paid in vodka, or where the currency were shoes. The gangs were rampant. It was impossible to walk in the streets. So there's a belief, I think there's a belief, widespread belief amongst Russians, that they need some iron fist to rule the country, which is otherwise too big and which was too corrupt. So again, my association with Mussolini. He was also the man who was officially against mafia. He was the one who brought the order to the country and so on.
They need a Leviathan, I suppose, to get some order.
And democracy is no value.
Yes.
So again, we come back to the Asian political thought. I don't think introducing in China would have much support. I mean, except the brave people of Taiwan or Hong Kong. But, well, the majority, it's a good question. Would they dare to say yes if nobody was listening?
That'll probably be a topic for a future discussion. But Marcin Kaczorowski, thank you very much for coming on to the programme. Great to have you. That's it. Do join us next time, Tuesdays 21:35, 9:35. Meantime, I recommend that you watch a British film, The Death of Stalin. It's a great black comedy. But see you then.